Tell us a little bit about some of the new research that you're working on.
Well, right now I've got several research projects that I'm working on. One is in the area of imitation. Some of the research that's been done coming out from other professionals has matched my clinical experience in terms of when you work with children with autism, you'll often find that people will start to teach them some imitation skills. And everybody understands that imitation is how we learn a lot of our skills. Typical children, adults, we learn by watching others do things. And every developmentalist and every other form of individual who studies learning of children are all in agreement that their observations of others, their learning to imitate, are absolutely critical skills. However, when you find people who are working with children with autism, they'll often teach them perhaps, maybe 10 or 20, maybe 30 imitative responses, and then they feel that the child can imitate. Well, you're in real trouble if you can't imitate very specific things. So for instance, if I do something like this, that's different than doing it like this. And it's different if I do it versus doing.
Right.
And people don't teach a lot of those discriminations for children. They may teach them some gross motor, tap their head, tap their tummy, stomp their feet, maybe even turn around. But what I found was that kids who were coming to me, people thought they could imitate very well, but I was finding that it was really holding them back from learning how to do what the other kids were doing. You take somebody who can just do a couple of gross motor imitations, maybe some fine motor imitations, and then you put them out on a playground and hope that they're going to imitate your typically developing peers and how they're building a castle, and it just doesn't happen.
Right.
So the subtle nuances are something that people haven't really investigated very much. The ABLES are, the Assessment of Basic Language and Learning Skills revised, that I revised 2 years ago. I more than doubled the items in the imitative repertoire because it was so critical that people pay attention to many of those distinctions. And when you go to the literature, it's very fascinating. My son actually did a literature review with me. We're trying to write it up soon so we can get it published. But what we found was when you start looking at the actual research that's out there in terms of how to teach somebody to imitate when they're not already imitating, there's almost no articles on there. There's only a handful of articles based on just a couple of kids, especially when you talk about children with autism. So when we have a population that really needs these types of skills and there's not much research behind it, we're really kind of in trouble as professionals. So we need to do more research in that area. So that's why this is a critical area that I'm beginning to do some research in. We actually ran some protocols, if you will, imitation studies with some typically developing children. And it turns out that by the time a child's about 3 or 4 years of age, they can imitate what you do, how you do it, without you even having to specify, do it exactly like I'm doing. And they can, if they can't do it the first time, with just another repetition of the demonstration, they're able to do it. Now, again, when I went back to the literature, there was very little in there. If children had imitation skills, then it turns out that they often could go ahead and develop further ones if people put an emphasis on that. With regards to the imitation research, I think one of the things we have to do is figure out, how and what these children are attending to, how to teach it and what they're attending to when you're trying to teach it. Because when you watch a typically developing child and you present a model to them, you've got their undivided, focused attention. And see, I think one of the things that happens with children with autism that we're working with, again, this is a broad category because everyone's different.
Right.
So, but when you look at a lot of the children who are having difficulty, it's trying to get their focused attention. And so this is another fact that's kind of interesting. An article came out in 2005 by Glenn Sallows and Gropner at the Wisconsin Early Autism Project. And they did a review of their programming for children. It was a replication of the Ivarlova study from '87. And one of the things that they were tracking was the predictors, if you will, for who is going to do well as a result of intensive early intervention programming. And one of their findings was that those children who imitated prior to receiving treatment actually did acquire skills faster than those kids that didn't. So one of the predictors for who's going to do well when you do intensive intervention comes back to the imitation repertoire. And again, it makes sense. They're under instructional control, they're watching you, they're being able to imitate you, so you've already got some skills that you can work with. And so it makes a lot of sense that we take a look at that. If you've got a child that's coming in to intervention and they're not imitating what others are doing, then that's probably an area that we need to hit pretty hard quickly to just try to develop the joint attention, the instructional control, the focused attention. All those areas are very critical, but there's almost no research in that area.
Right.
So
it's desperately needed.
It's desperately needed. It's desperately needed. That's one of my areas of research right now. There's two other areas that also involve the ABLES-R, the revised version of the ABLES, and that is one of the things that happened when it was developed. It was developed to try to identify skills that children needed to work on. And the measures were put in such a way such that you could actually see some changes over time with the child's development of particular skills within 25 repertoires that are being measured. And it was a valuable tool. However, one of the things that we were finding is that if two people were trying to evaluate the same child, the reliability of some of the measures weren't so accurate because it kind of depends on what they knew about the child and how they've seen the child under different conditions. So there were some variations in there. It still gave us a good description of what the child's skills were like and what the skill deficits were like. So it's still an extremely useful tool. However, in order for it to be evidence-based, as now is being required by the IDEA legislation, we've run some research this last year on most of the language, in fact, the language sections basically, and the visual performance section, the first page of the ABLES basically, where we've actually done studies where we've used systematic procedures to evaluate each of the items, such that we now have better reliability when using that particular type of measure, so that we can now say that it is evidence-based at this point. We've got the data to demonstrate that it really is measuring accurately.
And that's fantastic, because I know working with school systems, that's something that's very lacking. We've got to make sure that we have peer-reviewed, evidence-based data out there for these schools to work with, and that's a critical component. Absolutely,
absolutely. So we've done that this year. Another study that's underway right now that I'm working with Autumn Bailey on is we're tracking, we have the web ABLES now. So the ABLES-R is now on the internet so that we can track children on their development. And so what we've done is we've arranged for typically developing children to be assessed at 3-month intervals. So for instance, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21 months, and so on. We can actually then view what typical development is. Now, we're hoping, of course, that all these children will be typically developing. We know that about 1 in 150 probably won't be. But what we're hoping to do is gather a large enough database so we can actually show normative data on each individual skill, each of the 544 skills. We can also then measure the repertoires and the percentages of the repertoires that are being acquired by children at a certain age.
That's fantastic.
We're very excited about that.
I'm very excited about that.
Yeah.
Well, you have been a wealth of knowledge. I think a lot of parents have some great benefit from you. So we're very grateful that you took the time to talk with us today.
Well, I'm happy to do it. I always tell people I don't have all the answers, nor does anybody else. You know, we were working from science. We have science leads to technology. We learn from our students. But if the people are paying attention to the students' behavior, you'll learn a lot from them. Like I say, you should never listen to somebody who says they have all the answers. You should probably turn and run, because we don't. It's an evolving science and technology. But the one thing is very clear. We need to watch the students and let their behavior tell us what we're doing that works or isn't working. We should learn from them.